Hey everyone, and welcome to another video. So we recently had a tournament called the Modifier Tournament. It's a weekly tournament that Avid is now running, and we just had the first tournament yesterday, and I ended up winning that tournament, which is wonderful and very exciting. But I wanted to show you the deck that I took to that tournament and talk you through the decisions I made to maybe help you with some deck building and let you know a little bit about what I was thinking about when I put those cards into my deck. So the format of the tournament was that we were playing modified starter decks. So this is using the old starter deck. So if you're a new player, that starter deck has now changed. But if you were playing from yesterday and before, so the 27th of February, then the starter deck was very different than it is now. So the starter deck always has Zarothrix, Arcanist Supreme, and the rules of the tournament, you had to keep them as your Dungeon Master. And then you could change up to 10 cards from the starter deck with whatever cards you wanted in order to make your deck a little bit different than the original starter deck. And it led to some really interesting options, and we saw some really interesting different styles of decks come out from that, including a control deck and the burn deck that I made. So let's talk through which cards I added in first. So one of the first cards I added in was Arcane Experiment. This is a weird choice because I decided early on that I wanted to make my deck be a burn deck, because the worry I had was that there are two cards. There are the Ritual of Annihilation and Final Spell, which before the update that just happened, you could have 3 Ritual of Annihilations and you could put 3 Final Spells in. And if it got to turn 7, 8 or 9, you play your Ritual of Annihilation, which would do 20 damage if it fires, and it counts down for 8 turns. However, it counts down quicker each time you sacrifice one of your creatures. So what you could do is play Ritual of Annihilation on turn 7, 8 or 9, and then turn 10 you play Final Spell with a board full of about 7 units, and then you instantly trigger Ritual of Annihilation, dealing 20 damage, which usually is enough to finish off your opponent because everyone loses a little bit of health along the way. So it was a very powerful combo, and I was worried that people would play 3 Ritual of Annihilations, 3 Final Spells, and that would effectively be their whole strategy for their deck. Now the only way to beat that is to win before turn 10, or to control their board heavily. There's not a lot of options for controlling their board heavily, apart from playing Final Spell and hope you play it before they do. But the other option was to win before turn 10, and the only way I could see that happening is if you played a burn deck. So I wanted to make a burn deck, and the first card I put in was obviously my burn cards, but one of the cards I chose to put in was Arcane Experiment. I had 2 options here. I could either put in more burn cards to make them come up more often, or I could put in Arcane Experiment, which firstly is a cheap blocker. It draws a card, so it replenishes your hand and keeps your hand full. And also, if you play 3 spells, it comes back to your hand so you can replay it again. It was a weird choice because it doesn't directly affect my burn strategy. However, being able to use the Arcane Experiment to redraw, to get to those burn spells faster and get to those other mastery units faster really helped in this tournament. So it was a bit of a weird pick because it seems, when you first think about, oh, I want to play a burn deck, you think, how do I put 10 burn cards into this deck to make it better? But instead I chose to add a little bit more card draw to make it slightly more consistent. The second card I added, we can see here it's a one of Dreadful Drain. The reason why there's one of it is because you could change up to 10 cards, and I felt like this was the least useful of the burn cards that I had available. It only attacks your opponent's health, whereas sometimes I occasionally wanted to have the option of using a burn card to destroy a unit where I thought that was particularly significant. For example, if you're playing against another burn deck, being able to destroy one of their mastery units can give you a real edge in the race for getting enough mastery and doing enough damage. The next card I added was what I thought would be a guaranteed card in the winning deck. I think it's the best card of the tournament, is Call of the Old God. Now, the reason why this card is good is firstly, as Avid mentioned in his stream, it lets you bypass the rules of the deck building, really, because you can only put 10 cards in your deck that were not from the original starter deck. However, putting this in, when you play it, it puts more copies of itself into your deck that don't have this last line of text. So it effectively let you bypass the limits of deck construction and have effectively 15 or so cards in your deck by the end of a round, so that your deck was now further divergent from the original starter deck. This card works really well with Zarothrix because dealing 1 damage to any target is occasionally useful, but with Zarothrix having Mastery 1 on himself as a Dungeon Master means that this doing 2 damage to any target whenever you play it is a huge difference. 2 damage is enough to deal with a lot of problematic units in the game, including the Mastery 2 unit, which I was worried that other people might have in their decks. But also once you get a bit more Mastery, being able to deal 3 damage with this quite easily is pretty amazing, and it also draws you a card so it replaces itself when you play it, which helps you keep your hand full and can help you keep a burn spell in hand for every turn so you can maximize the value you're getting from your Mastery. And then the last card I put in here is the Loyal Spell Shaper. It's a reasonably new card, but it says Mastery 2 on it, so it has to go in my burn deck. Mastery 2 is such a huge difference in the value of the spells you're playing. This unit has 2 attack and 2 health, but with the Mastery 2, I'm using this unit to do about 6 to 8 damage per game with just 1 copy of it on its own. And also its last word, if it does fire, it is a way that I could potentially guarantee a win. I could push this unit in to let it die, knowing that if they do block it and kill it, then I'll get a burn spell back to my hand, which might be just what I need to win the game. So effectively it has a bit of card draw in it through that effect. So those are all the cards I put in, but then where did I make cuts from my deck to make it better? So the first card I got rid of was, of course, the worst card in the game, which is Poisoned Gift. I took out 3 copies of that straight away. I knew I didn't want it in my deck. It is a spell, it does draw you a card, but it effectively lets you gain health. So realistically it says deal 1 damage, draw a card. That's not good enough for this deck, so I didn't want it in there, and I got rid of that very quickly. The other card I was quick to get rid of was the deck came with 3 Till Undeath Do Us Parts. I took out 2 of those. I could have taken out another one and put in a different unit, but I thought, you know what, maybe there's a time when it might be useful on its own. It didn't really come up. I don't think I played it in the whole tournament. There might have been a turn where I had some spare mana, so I thought to play it. But for the most part, it was just there to have an option just in case I needed to make my skeletons a little bit bigger in order to deal with a certain situation, in case I didn't win early and I had to win late instead. Other changes I made, I got rid of Mind Corruption. The reason why I got rid of this is because it's bugged. That should be fixed now. It might not be, we'll have to check. But effectively when you played it, there was a chance that you would just cause yourself not to be able to attack, then your opponent wouldn't be able to defend. And I don't want to play with buggy cards. I don't think it's a good good sportsmanship either, to have that risk on the table of we play it all the way to turn 5, you play this card, and then you ruin the game and no one can play anymore, and it's all a bit of a mess. I was expecting this card to be banned because of the bug around it. I was expecting it to be that here is another rule for the tournament, you cannot play Mind Corruption, but that did not happen. So that was where 3 of my cards went. So far, 3 from Mind Corruption, 3 from Poisoned Gift, and then 2 from Till Undeath Do Us Part. And then the last 2 are just here. I took out 1 Trap Engineer and 1 Zealous Archivist. The reason why I did that, these are both expensive cards. I would hate to have 3 in my hand at once. So by having 2 in my deck, I really limit the chance of having those clog up my hand. I don't particularly plan to play the Trap Engineer. In fact, my deck maybe would have been better if I put in a 3rd Zealous Archivist rather than a Trap Engineer. But again, there might have been a few situations where the 1 damage when you block from Trap Engineer might have been significant. So I thought I'd keep it as 2 and 2 just to keep my options open. And that's really all there is to that deck. One of the things I really enjoyed was using the Tombstone Mimic, which usually I wouldn't play, but if they did decide to kill your Loyal Spell Shaper, which is the best way to deal with a burn deck, is to take their Mastery off the board, you could use the Tombstone Mimic to just make another one and have another unit of Mastery 2, which was pretty amazing. Another really interesting thing about the deck is Call of the Old God. A lot of the time you think as soon as you get it you might want to play it, but there are a few times where I purposely held off on playing it and played different cards instead, because I knew that as soon as I play Call of the Old God I was going to increase the chance of me drawing a burn card, and I might not necessarily be in the position where I wanted that to happen. I might have preferred having the option to draw maybe into a Spring Trap with more chance, or draw into something like the Reconstructor so that I can get enough blockers on the board. It was dependent on the situation, but timing when you should play the Call of the Old God was very important. There was one game where I managed to play Call of the Old God. I got 2 fresh copies of it, the ones that have Shuffle More into your deck early on. I had a few mastery units as well, so I was pretty confident with that game that if I play down the mastery units, drop a Call of the Old God, and then drop the other one later, then I'm going to have enough burn cards coming in that effectively I could sit back, just take the attacks from them, knowing that I'll have enough damage guaranteed coming up in my deck. I think there are definitely some things I could have changed to make this deck slightly better, but it had enough of a different strategy that caught people off guard. And I think also, honestly, I probably did get a bit lucky with my hands a few times in the tournament. This deck is really great if you get a solid hand, and if you get just an okay hand, it has less chance of winning, but often it's still a little bit ahead of a lot of other decks. Fortunately, not many people, in fact I don't think anyone, was playing the combo of Rich of Annihilation and Final Spell, probably because I don't know anyone actually that has 3 copies of each. But fortunately I didn't come up against that. I did come up against one opponent who played a great Revitalization on turn 7 when I'd had a really bad draw so far in terms of getting mastery units, and them healing about 5 or 6 health with that really set the distance apart, and it meant that I just couldn't come back from that, and then it was over for me. I think they also in fact had 2 of these, so they played one which healed them up a lot, and it draws them 2 cards, so it probably drew them into another one which they then played to win the game by doing the damage to me with it. In terms of playing this deck, one of the things to also remember is that I don't care about my own life in this matchup, I care about my opponent's. So early on, you're going to be very aggressive. You're going to throw out your Zarothrix if they have no other units. You're going to throw out your Arcane Experiment if they have no other units. You don't mind taking 2 damage if you can get 1 or 2 damage on them. It doesn't matter if you're trading evenly. As long as you're getting some damage on them, it's probably worth your time, especially with the Arcane Experiment, because if they then block it with their Zarothrix, then they're going to take 2 damage. Also, you're going to draw a card, which is great. There are a few times when you don't want to do that. If you're planning to play a Dread Experiments, or if you're planning to play a Reconstructor, then you might not want to do that. But for the most part, it was worth being really aggressive with my units to get them down to 25 health just on the few early turns of attacking with units. And that's all there is to it. So there's my full deck. You can see my curve is a bit wild. The starter deck is not an amazing curve, so tweaking it still ends up a bit of an odd shape, but fortunately we managed to win, and it was a really good fun tournament. I was really pleased to see that the opponent I came up against in the final was using a control deck. Unfortunately, the way that the cards came up in that final 2 games, I didn't quite get to see the kind of synergy that he'd put together, because it's more of a late game strategy, and the burn deck was killing people off around turn 7, 8, 9. But it was really cool to see someone bring such a interesting variation on the starter deck to that final. So thank you to Zarothrix for building such an awesome deck to come up against in the final, and thank you to Avid for organising the tournament. I'm looking forward to the next one, and you should too. You can find it on the Discord. It will be posted in advance, and I believe that next week's is going to be all about Lich decks only, which is going to be very interesting because there's a lot less restriction. It's just you have to play the Lich, and I'm really interested to see how that's going to work out.